everyone. Thank you very much for, sorry, just, we'll be recording the session, by the way, I'm just that now. Hello, again, thank you very much for joining today's session. We're going to be talking about protecting workers from heat stress. So first of all, introducing myself, I'm Rafael, membership manager at Bonsucro, and we're very happy with our collaboration with Systembolaget, Vinmonopolet, and Nalco, and Isla network to bring to you the latest knowledge and experience we have on heat stress and preventing the chronic kidney disease that affects sugarcane workers. This session was intended mostly for the rum sector, so we have in Bonsucro many distilleries and rum companies that are interested in this topic and committed to Bonsucro, and it grew from that. I think we have people from other sectors attending as well, but we wanted to talk specifically to rum companies primarily. We see in Bonsucro a huge momentum for sustainable rum. Over 25% of membership applications to Bonsucro this year were from the rum sector, and we're starting to see a lot of interest in sustainable rum to final consumers as well. And we have here today on the call many of the rum brands and key distilleries and traders in the sector. One thing we would like to highlight, of course, this experience with Isla and the Adelante initiative has been going on for many years. I'm sure you've heard about it before. And we are integrating the learnings that you're going to hear from Jason today into the Bonsucro standard. We're currently revising the Bonsucro production standard, and the process is approaching its end. So we just received the latest rounds of comments and public consultation. This is now being processed, and hopefully in a couple of months we'll have that revision finalized. If you want to know more about it, you can visit the Bonsucro website. I'll post the link on the chat here later, where you can see the latest draft as well as a summary of the comments we received. So yeah, we now, further ado, I'll hand over to Sasha from Vinmonopolet. Thank you again, Sasha, for partnering with us for this webinar.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many rum brands on board for this meeting today. Some of you joined some of our initial planning for this specific module that we've been rolling out the last year, along with the experts, or I shall say, I was more joining the experts from the Isla network on providing this information, along with the cooperation with Bonsucro. The event today is not only sponsored by Vinmonopolet, it is also promoted by the other alcohol Nordic monopolies. Alco has asked us to warmly greet everyone that's attended today, and also Systembolaget. It's important to note that this type of intervention is being seen as something that really will address some of our highest risk in our supply chains. Heat stress is a possibility, unfortunately, or the possibility of being exposed for heat stress is increasing as we see the climate increasing throughout our supply chain. When I say climate's increasing, I mean basically the exposure to heat. I apologize. The Norwegian has ruined my English. I just realized. But we see that heat stress is a worry within our supply chains. We need to address this within our supply chains, and it's really important for us that we can cooperate with others, and that means cooperating with our importers, but also the brands that create the products that we sell. Rafael, I believe we can also share an article by Bonsucro, maybe during this event, about a joint statement from Nordic alcohol monopolies on the importance of sourcing responsibly and also looking into this aspect of heat stress. Now, some of you might have joined and do not know the concept of heat stress. So Jason, I'm going to give the word over to you and your team. So to explain more about what is this issue and what could be the ultimate consequence and what could be the ultimate good result from preventing heat stress.
Great, thank you. Thanks for everybody for hosting and for everybody who's attended. I'm going to kind of get right to it because we're a bit tight on time. And I'd like to hear from people, their thoughts and any questions they have as soon as possible. So some of the early stuff like the climate is warming, we'll kind of cruise right through because I think there's agreement there. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to turn off my video and get right to it. But thanks so much for attending and see you on the other side. So thanks again to the hosts. It's been a great series. I mean, I think we had over 160 call-ins from producers in the region, and that was with many rooms full of other people. So we think it was over 200 folks who attended. So that was really great to see. And this is the last one, kind of focusing more on rum brands. And I think we have some friends from Coca-Cola here as well. And I'm really glad they're able to join, and ED and F-Man and others. So thanks everybody for making it. Again, we know the climate is warming, right? It's getting hot, but what does this mean? What does this mean for the workers and our supply chains? That's what we're talking about today. But it became very real for people in the northern climes, like in the US and Europe this year because of heat waves, especially in the Pacific Northwest. You've seen a massive reaction from the Department of Labor in the US and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to finally address this issue that's been quite frankly misaddressed and underaddressed in the USA. But also with USAID and International Labor Affairs Bureau, with the Department of Labor, really focusing on these issues with a series of grant calls that have come out in the last 6 months. And we've been really lucky to be part of that. We were asked to advise the Office of the Vice President Harris on migration and the nexus of migration, climate change, and occupational health. And we made the argument that, you know, if people don't see a future, they're going to migrate. So we need to improve conditions, especially in the Northern Triangle and other places, if we're so worried about what some of the outcomes might be. And it landed, so that's quite good. So policy is changing. This isn't a fringe issue anymore. We were definitely on the vanguard for a long time. We no longer are. It's interesting. There's a whole smorgasbord of folks involved now, from really good groups, some pretenders, and some folks just trying to figure it out. So it's a much more interesting, productive time with that mix than it was kind of pushing a boulder up a hill. So it's been a breakthrough year for sure. This is a model we developed at LIN. This is an algorithm we use looking at a bunch of routine data and some specific data that we have. And this is right now. So if you kind of think about what the risk to occupationally acquired injuries and illnesses, not just CKD&T that a lot of you are familiar with, but overall heat stress rises, the incidence of those as well. And, you know, depending on your workload, like a lighter workload might be somebody working on drip irrigation on a sugar mill. A heavy workload would be like a seed cutter or a burn cane cutter. And we're already in a position now where the risk is very high for injury throughout the region. I mean, this extends kind of throughout the tropics, but a lot of what we're talking about today is kind of Central America. So I kind of honed in on there for the audience. So let's talk about this heat stress thing. A lot of us might think, well, Jason, it's hot. Like, why would this lead to all these outcomes like lower productivity and, you know, heat strokes and injury? You know, why is that going up, especially in the sugar sector? You know, it's always been hot. Well, a couple things we'll talk about later. It's getting hotter and the extremes are higher. But as importantly, it's the intersection of workload and the environmental temperature. And so that can be described here in this video. Ernesto, if you want to take the video.
Working person is a special person. He does activities like exercising, and that impacts your heat stress as well. Heat stress is one thing that involves the temperature, the wind, and the workload of a person. When dehydration comes, automatically there is something to do, some damage that happens to the kidneys too.
see the figures of the prevalence of how many people are sick of kidney disease, it's outrageous.
Certain communities in Nicaragua, but also in El Salvador, but among men, chronic kidney disease is what kills them.
Tenemos alrededor de 40, 50 pacientes mensuales, o sea, un promedio de 2 o 3 diarios que vienen a la unidad de emergencia a buscar tratamiento de diálisis. Áreas que antes eran algodoneras y hoy son áreas de caña, ¿verdad? Por eso que inicialmente se pensó en la agricultura. Las temperaturas pueden llegar arriba de los 40, casi 50 grados, se deshidratan muy rápidamente.
Yo prácticamente llevo 5 años, 5 años cortando caña. Esfuerza su cuerpo al máximo, se puede fundir de un solo, queda como un carro que ya no funciona, ni aunque le echen gasolina a los que caen. No le hacen hasta ajuste de motor, así es uno. O sea, uno tiene un límite hasta donde llegar.
People working in agriculture, people working in construction, who are under the hot blazing sun throughout the day, and they have targets that they have to deliver. So they have to continue working.
If a person has CKD, that person is affected, and the family is affected. And if you widen the scope, the community is affected.
There may be many more people affected that we don't know about in countries where there have been no studies yet. It's research that is on the front line. It has not been done before.
For us, having this collaborative network is definitely beneficial for the research. It's beneficial for the cause that we are all working towards.
Para que nosotros sigamos adelante y viendo que la vida no solamente es matar, sino que es saberse controlar su cuerpo también.
Just to recap, it's just really about that intersection of environmental heat. So if you're working really hard, you're building up what's called your core temperature. And if it's a cool day and you have the proper clothing, that gets into the atmosphere and you're fine. You'll cool off and you can take a break, and that's great. But if you're, trying to deliver targets due to piece rate, or because you're living in poverty and you have to hit the targets and you work through that desire to take a break, then you're in trouble, especially in a hot environment, because then the heat won't escape in the environment, especially when it's humid and your core temperature goes up and up and up. It causes what's called leaky gut in the gut, and your gut becomes porous, and things that should never be in your circulatory system enter your circulatory system, and that causes a systemic inflammatory response. And that can lead to things like heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat illness. And there are a number of studies coming out shortly that show this, for a number of reasons, localizes, especially with heavy workers, in the kidney. So the pathophysiology is becoming clearer and clearer. There's already publications on that as far as that income of CKD&T. But the other issue is just outright early mortality due to heat stroke. And we saw a lot of that right here in the US this summer. It was really shocking how many people died. But I think a lot of the people here that are familiar with occupational safety and health know that higher heat and heat stress lead to other occupationally acquired injuries and illness. There was, in fact, a study this summer that said it was like a 35% increase. So it's really no joke. We really have to control this. The other thing from a production side is it reduces productivity. If you try to push through, you're actually less productive than if you kind of take a circuit approach and take a break and then re-enter the work. And again, just to recap on those external factors, right? How hot is it outside? What's the temperature? Do you have a piece rate that you have to hit, a target you have to hit? The lack of shade is a big issue. And then clothing. I mean, one of the things I always marvel at is you'll see sugarcane workers cutting sugarcane in 40-degree heat with jeans. I don't know if anybody lives in Washington, D.C. or, the US South, and you kind of avoid jeans like the plague. So it's not good. I mean, like we have things to do still to think about, like better clothing and better breathability. We do have wicking shirts, but like the pants trap a lot of heat, and that heat just leads to higher core temperature. So there's a lot to, figure out how to make work with current supply chains, with costs, and with making it viable for the workforce and the employer. The internal factors, dehydration plays a role, but one thing I really want to make clear today for those of you working on this independently and with us is you can be completely dehydrated and have, or completely hydrated and have a heat stroke, have kidney damage. Hydration certainly will help mitigate some of the damage done for physiological reasons we can talk about offline. I'm certainly not saying do not hydrate, but it is secondary to controlling that core temperature. Your metabolic load is your workload. Your health condition really matters. If you're out of shape, you're going to have a much harder time. And things like fever, sick leave is so important. This has to start taking place in labor forces. Like if you're sick, you should not be working, especially during COVID. But if you're paid by piece and you don't have a paid day off, you're going to work through and maybe expose your colleagues to COVID or the flu or any other infectious disease. But you're also at a much higher risk of a heat stroke. In fact, we've worked with the US military quite a lot on our work with the Marine Corps and the Army. And one of the things we saw there is the biggest risk was if you had recently had a fever or a cold, because your thermoregulatory system is off for a number of days. So sick leave is really something we need to push for laborers. Also, just if you have a repetitive injury and you just need some recovery time, you're now going to work through that injury and make it worse. And then that has much bigger impacts as a whole on society and on the individual, right? You're going to get less productivity, which means less earnings. There's social impact when kids have to enter the workforce to replace the parents. That's still definitely an issue throughout Mesoamerica. That's not gone away. We should be very aware of that. The impact on the health services, you saw my friend Ricardo, who runs the renal clinic in El Salvador. The average age for patients there is 34. And they're all from the lowlands, and they're all from like sugarcane and rice producing areas. It's terrible. It's really something to visit Hospital Rosales and see what they're up against and how underfunded it still is. And dialysis, for those of you who don't know, providing dialysis treatment to everybody who has diabetes-driven nephropathy, much less this as well, this is something that will bankrupt any country. This is a huge drag on economies. You're removing people from their prime earning years when we don't control heat illness and they get CKD or they get otherwise injured. You're driving kids into the workforce, and then you have this huge medical cost. So there's really a responsibility not to externalize these risks that we need to take into account. The individual issues we talked about, right? The long-term can be something like kidney failure, outright death, and then you have an increased risk of accidents and injuries. And if that isn't intuitive, I mean, just think about being really hot and exhausted, and you're just more likely to cut yourself, more likely to take a tumble, and that's where things go wrong. This isn't just about sugarcane, but today we are talking about sugarcane. But for those of you working in other supply chains, it's important to recognize that anywhere you're seeing heavy labor with inadequate labor protections in high heat, you're going to see this disease. So we see it in mining. We're actually working with a gold company right now to address it. You see it in construction. We're seeing guys come back from the World Cup 2022, going back to Nepal. There'll be an editorial in the journal, the British Medical Journal's Occupational Health Journal in the next month that we just wrote about workers coming back from Qatar with this disease to Nepal. And it's always these workers going back to poor countries that can't afford that burden. Coconut workers, if you've ever seen them work, it's really quite the job. They climb up like a 30-foot or a 10-meter coconut tree and back up and down all day in highly exposed conditions. Rice is a problem, and of course, sugarcane. So if we focus on Mesoamerica, where we kind of have the best data, I wanted to go over something. This is using routine data from the health ministries we were able to acquire it from. We're going to be able to acquire it from the others shortly because we just were awarded a contract with the Pan American Health Organization to get this data with them. And so the ministries will collaborate with PAHO. That's a given. But what you basically see is where there's high intensity cane, and we didn't see it in low intensity cane, and where it's high intensity cane in the heat, you see a direct association with kidney failure in the general population. And so it's really unlikely that it's not in Belize. It's extremely unlikely that it's not in Honduras. I know that in Honduras down here, they test the workers pre-harvest for the disease. So, if people say we don't have it, I think that one of the issues we have to say is like, well, if you have heat stress in these hot areas and you have unvalidated interventions, we need to know what's going on, because that's how we can address and assess and improve. We already have confirmation that it is in this area of Panama. This is all coming out soon. So, just keep that in mind when you're looking at your supply chains. People might say, oh, we don't have it. There's no proof we have it. I would say at this point, given that every country has denied having it historically until recently, the burden is to show that you do not to claim that you might not. And I think it's really easy to do now, and we're really happy to help. Like, there's point of care devices. It's really not very invasive, and just establish the reality so we can address it together. And as you'll see, we can do it. It's totally within reason to make this a memory. And that really has to be the goal with CKD and heat stress in general. Like I said, it's no longer a boutique issue. This is being heavily published on by our group and others. And then the question of like, why now? That's a really great question. I love this question, actually. I think piece rate work has changed because you're no longer working with farmers. You're now working with like laborers on multiple farms. Even if a mill doesn't own all their land, they often manage the labor force or contract the labor force out. It's no longer a farmer producing for a couple of weeks. It's a work group that works 6 to 7 days a week and moves throughout the harvest. It's definitely getting hotter out there. And then that intensification of the agriculture more than the industrialization is a big issue. The other one is just increased research and surveillance. I remember 6 years ago, the Guatemalan ambassador said there was no CKD&T in Guatemala when I was in London. 3 years ago at Bonsucro, a guy from one of the big groups in Mexico said they didn't have a problem in Tierra Blanca. And of course, we now know they do. And we have a DOL, Department of Labor funded project there addressing it. So, I understand the fear of this thing. It's scary, but it's so addressable. So hopefully that can be mitigated by showing what's possible to do about it. But when people say they don't have it, again, just, check. Because what we see is, places that have been really hot for a long time and the temperature is rising, like northwestern Costa Rica. You see the men here on the right in that area who are the laborers, and the sugar cultivation going up and up and up over the years. And what you end up with, by the 80s, this thing was already at epidemic levels compared to the rest of the country. Really kind of terrifying how long this went on and went unaddressed. And I hope we can avoid that in other places, because nothing should have gone on this long without being aggressively addressed, because it is mortal. It is really ripping communities apart, and we can do something about it. So who's the most affected it's really, again, it's that workload, the people working the hardest at the job, but we shouldn't just focus on those burned cane cutters in the cane industry. The seed cutters are also really affected. And even lighter jobs like drip irrigators, you'll get the occasional heat stroke. I mean, Dennis and I have picked up, like, security guards will get it. And it'll be like 1 versus 100 in another group with kidney damage over the harvest. But it's that hot. So it's really about the jobs with the most intense work being at the highest risk, but it's so hot in these environments that, anybody can end up with a heat stroke and subsequent kidney damage and other injuries. So it's really, really important to kind of think about, when you're checking out interventions, assessing interventions, to think of the whole workforce and what that is. And when you're looking at the data here, keep in mind, this data was taken at a mill with a 6-hour to 7-hour workday, with an intervention in place and an improving intervention. So this wasn't even taken in places where the interventions are unvalidated, untested, or there is no intervention. These are situations where it's a best case scenario, and these jobs are so hard, there's still work to be done. And so if you think about who has the highest core temperature, again, in this best case scenario, you have people that are going over 38 degrees, and 38 degrees Celsius is kind of your danger zone. You want to keep that below that, because if you spend too long and too many days above that threshold, that's when you start seeing these really nasty health outcomes. And sure enough, the people with the correlated above 38 are the folks that have the damage, the kidney injury over a harvest. Next video. Ernesto, oh, you got it. There you go. Thanks, man. Yeah, so this is kind of like, we kind of wish we would have had the technology that we have now to measure the heart rate and the core temp when the conditions are still like this. This is a number of years ago, but this is still the reality in much of the world. You know, no PPE to speak of, no access to anything for protection, water, rest or shade, totally exposed to the elements. You know, back then folks were working like 7 days a week. And that's really what motivated the work, right? Is kind of seeing that. And then, you know, like Dennis wasn't happy with that happening in the supply chain. We weren't happy with that happening in general. And that's why we came together to do Adelante, is just to kind of make that a memory, because nobody should be working a job that tough like that. Just kind of a reference point. You're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, how hard are these guys actually working? And again, these are cane workers. They're only working 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. This is like your best case scenario in the region right now. And even them, when they're compared to like special forces on a military operation and to ultra endurance racers, their workload is commensurate. But here's the kicker. That adventure racer, like if you think of your x-axis as a frequency and your intensity as your y-axis, that adventure racer and that military operative, they're doing that like maybe 8 times a year. Maybe some of the really hardcore adventure racers are going more, but the SEALs only go out like a number of times a year. They rotate the teams, and that's who we're looking at. And these cane cutters are basically at the same level as an adventure racer and a military operative, but they're going out every day in some cases for 6 months straight, sometimes longer depending on the country. And then also, you know, some of them just don't get a break. You can see the drip irrigators down there. So when you take all this into consideration, you really want to, at the beginning, like if you're limited on resources, you want to focus on those high risk jobs first, and then work down your supply chain to the lower risk jobs if you're dealing with like a resource issue. And this, again, will show you kind of like the heart rate across the day, which is a good indicator of workload. And you can see where our breaks are to try to keep that workload within reason, but you can see how fast it spikes back up, and why it's really important to have those repetitive breaks to kind of keep things within reason with the cooling of the body. So what do we do about this, right? This is tough. This is a tough environment, you know, often in resource poor settings. And well, this is what we're doing about it. Great, thanks, Ernesto. So there we are at the Adelante initiative at Ingenio San Antonio, and like I cannot say enough good things. I mean, I think some of you who know the whole history may be surprised at how warm the relationships are, but I think it's just about, you know, pragmatism and people that were concerned and came together and said enough tit for tat back in the day, and let's just get to work. And we immediately did. There was very little transition period. I mean, Dennis and his team are unequaled. They're incredible. They're always thinking about how to make things better. Aside from heat illnesses and CKD&T, I've just been crunching some numbers on general injuries in the workforce, and it looks like they've reduced it something like 68% in the last few years. And it might be better than that. I still have to crunch the numbers. So sorry, Dee, about that. I'm still working on it. But it's just looking really good. It's just an incredible group. Ricardo, who's the CEO, has just really championed this and really pushed it forward. And there's no excuses here. Like, you know, we don't always hit the targets. It's a learning process, and everybody is constantly going, how do we make this better? How can we keep pushing? There's never any finger pointing. It's always just, how do we get this done? And it's been one of the most rewarding processes I've ever been part of. And I just want to give a shout out to Dennis and his team, because it's just been a great relationship. And Bonsucro has been instrumental. It's never would have gotten started without Bonsucro. They really got everybody to the table and asked an important question: what do you actually want here? And everybody said, we want workers not to be sick. And they said, well, okay, get to work then. And we did. And the DEG and the BMZ were instrumental in providing the funding. And now the Department of Labor is funding a similar project with Beta San Miguel up in Mexico that we're working with World Vision. And it looks like there'll be a big project for the Northern Triangle evolving now. Fair Trade USA has come on board. We've used the findings from the work to inform both standards. Bonsucro is looking really good on the current revision. It doesn't look like there's any pushback. For those of you who remember when we tried to put in heat stress mitigations 5 years ago, and we're kind of yelled out of the room what a difference 5 years can make. Everybody was like, yep, this makes sense. So it's a lot of progress. And I credit Adelante for that. It's really incredible. And also the other mills that are starting to take this on in groups. It really caused a ripple effect. So the basics are, I mean, it sounds so simple, right? Water, rest, shade, and sanitation. I mean, these are basic things. They were absent. And if they're not implemented well, they're little more than window dressing, whether intentional or not. I've seen everything. I've visited mills where it's just a total Potemkin village and they're trying to fool you into thinking this is what they do for everybody. We've seen mills where they've done a phenomenal job and they're doing the best they can with what they've got. And then we've seen mills where they've got the elements, but the practice isn't there yet and the implementation. And even in the best case scenario, when you're dealing with a 75,000 hectare mill or source of land, and you're running thousands of workers and work teams, and there's a constantly shifting environment logistically, it's not so simple. And that's kind of where we are now, is the refinement of the program. But it's basically, you got to have the scheduled breaks. It's all about controlling that core temperature, giving people a chance to cool off. And there's a really interesting insight you'll learn about shortly. Shaded rest, huge. Can't just be hanging out in the field or near the cane. And then hydration, potable water is a must. If you have the budget, if there's a budget within the employer, definitely like a Suero or hydrating drink, an electrolyte drink. And then hygiene is important. More and more women are entering the workforce, sadly, because more and more men got sick. And there's other economic drivers as well. You got to give women a safe place to use the restroom if you're encouraging intake, right? So that's the basics. Everybody should have an insulated cooler. You need coolers for refill for your hydration drink and your water. And then the mill in Nicaragua has done a phenomenal job of creating a potable water system, and everybody dumps out their water in the morning that they might have brought from home and make sure that they have pure water, just to avoid any potential interactions with toxins. We're not seeing much in our data at all, actually, but you want to eliminate the risk. Everybody should have potable water, not just migrant workers, not just local workers, everybody. Hydration, though, might surprise you if you kind of think of the heat category of how hot it is and the heavy work. You really don't want to overhydrate. That can be extremely dangerous, especially with people losing salt. The rule of thumb is you really don't want to go over a liter of water an hour. And then you want maybe 1 unit of the electrolyte solution, which is about 250 milliliters. But don't overhydrate. You want to hydrate enough, but overhydrating can be a big negative, actually. It can actually kill you. So it's important not to overdo that. Sanitation in the field is key, as we've mentioned, and especially during COVID. Shaded rest is really important. Make sure that tent is covered on 2 sides. It seems simple. Make sure it's mobile and it can get close to the cutting front. It's just really important. And if you have stools, it's important because the ground is hot and it'll just conduct heat right into the body. And you want to limit how many people are in each tent, because human beings, when they're hot, are like little furnaces running around, and now you're in a semi-enclosed environment. So you want to have space between people. And that's kind of the idea there, right? That's kind of your setup. This is recorded. If any of you want the presentation, I can send it to you. That's no problem. It's pretty low tech, right? but it's just about implementation. So we really, the environmental temperature is important, but if you kind of look at the OSHA guidelines and the temperature, the average temperature here on the right and the areas we work, if you followed OSHA guidelines on a lot of days, these are the hottest days, these are the coolest days, these are the average days of our harvest, nobody would be working. And we're actually working with Indiana University because it looks like these guidelines might be overly aggressive and they're not really based on much. But we still want to protect health. We don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what we're trying to do is figure out, like, when do people actually start cresting this dangerous point? And what we found, and this agrees with military data, is human beings don't like doing heavy work first thing in the morning. That's the easiest way to put it. The reasons for that aren't completely clear, but the data is clear. Is you can see from 6 to 7 a.m., this is the first year with the first rest schedule that the mill had, at the time considered the most progressive break schedule and program in the region. And you can see people, even though it's not that hot out, they're already cresting 38 at 7 a.m. because the work is that heavy. And so what we realized is you need to move the breaks earlier. And so each year, this is the observation year, year one, where we just observed and started building the new system. And this is at a mill that had breaks, that had a short work day, that you can see breaks at 9, breaks at 10, breaks at 11. You still had a very high incidence of kidney injury over the harvest and disease. And then, the second year for these different groups, the other jobs, the 2 heavy groups, we started introducing a break earlier and you see a reduction. And then the third year, you see even a bigger reduction. And it goes from there. And so far, we haven't seemed to have hit the productivity. We don't have the numbers yet from year 3 on productivity, but from what I understand from Dennis, there's no concern. But that's the key objective. Like, if I had to boil it down to something, make sure people are adequately hydrated. But the really big thing, the big insight we've had over the last 3 years, and I talked about this in Thailand for those of you who were there, is this heat stress issue. You got to keep that core temperature down. And to do that, you need to introduce breaks that might earlier, especially for the heavy jobs, then might be intuitive. You might think, oh, it doesn't get hot till 9, which is what we thought, which is what Dennis thought, which is what the research community thought. But the problem with human beings is when we get hot, we're really bad at cooling off. So you got to interrupt that cycle earlier and it'll pay dividends. So these are the recommended rests that we have right now. It seems like a lot. Like I said, it's not hurting the productivity. It's not hurting the workday. Kind of the opposite. And we can send this to you guys. Anybody who's interested, quite happily. And implementation is really key. That's what I want to talk about next. You got to keep that tent close. You got to keep the material close. And, if it's a low resource setting, that kind of puts the workers in a tough position because they're probably going to have to move the tents and gear with them. But I've seen workers adapt to that pretty well. Like, they'll put the water coolers into the cane and then keep the tent and then make sure they're filled up. So they adapt. It's not ideal. If you're at a high resource mill, having teams that are dedicated to supporting the workers, like health promoters, is really, really good play. And we've shown a positive ROI even with those extra employees. But implementation is not easy. Like ISA, like I said, I can't say enough good about how seriously they take this. But again, they're dealing with, I think, like 75,000 hectares of land that they're sourcing from. Their supervisors, many of them are very good, but I mean, very few of them have had more than a high school education. Like, this takes time. Change takes time, even in the best situations. So you can't just assess, like, do I have a program? It's how well am I implementing it and what are my outcomes? And you can see, like, we all tend to estimate ourselves better than an outsider might, but they're actually pretty close observations if you just kind of combine the green and yellow on both to, like, acceptable versus unacceptable. And they're not that far off. And, that didn't bother us either because our observations were only 20 days. This isn't to say that there's something really wrong. This is to say that even in the best case scenario, support is needed for those early years until it just becomes normal, till it becomes normal practice. And it has impacts, right? So the first harvest where we observed, we saw this very high level of kidney injury over the harvest. And this is something I want to say as well. A lot of mills screen people at the beginning of the harvest, but they don't screen people at the end of the harvest. So there's no way to know if they're causing damage to the workforce or not. Screening people out at the beginning is fine. You don't want sick workers in such a condition. working condition, no way. But if you don't do it at the end of harvest as well, you're kind of, the early screening just becomes a liability exercise ultimately. The later screening allows you to understand, like, are you hitting your targets? Are you reducing disease and injury? But they had a mechanized harvester breakdown, and they had to split the work fronts. And that led to a lack of materiel that was spread out. So implementation was pretty weak that first year. And we saw these numbers. And the second year, we saw this massive reduction because everybody was quite shocked at this high number. And there's major focus on these burn king cutters. But then what we saw, despite that, this kind of stabilization of the seed cutters, we still saw a 72% reduction overall in just the second year. But here's where it got really interesting. So Dennis and I evaluated the implementation between the different fronts of the seed cutters. So like groups of about 60. And it was a dose response, just as heat stress is. I showed you how heat stress is a dose response. Here we have a dose response and implementation. So we had one guy that just was not on board, difficult, and he had pretty bad implementation. And you saw these really bad outcomes. We had someone who was okay, and they were right about the average. And there was a woman who was really committed, and she basically eliminated kidney injury in her workforce. And so that's what's possible when everything gels. And this is where it gets really interesting. So kidney injury over harvest can have all sorts of noise in it. Like people can recover, like it might just be one bad day that you measured. Like it's the body and biomarkers are in flux. And so unless we follow all these people, which we are for 5 years to see their long-term outcomes, we really don't know that much about what that data means other than it looks good. It's very positive. But if they actually have kidney injury, is it sustained? That's still another year off why we analyze the data over the last 4 or 5 years. But what is unquestionable is we know that if you are hospitalized from a heat illness and have acute kidney injury in the clinic, at least 10% of those people within just the first 6 to 12 months will end up with kidney disease. It's that fast. It's that aggressive. And it was much higher than any of us thought, even at a mill that had a program. So imagine what's going on at mills that don't have a program, and the burden these people are presenting to places that don't have a clinic onto the public system. And so what's so interesting though, is by the second year, we bring it way down. By the third year, it's basically eliminated. So you have a 63% reduction and a 94% reduction of the no ifs, ands, or but, no question, this situation causes long-term disease. Within 5 years, you would have a 5-fold risk factor for those who had had these acute kidney injuries. And we are basically eliminating one of the highest risks, one of the most well-known established pathophysiologies of what leads to long-term disease. And I have to hand it to Dennis, because this is cool. This is why you get out of bed in the morning. Or we do anyway. So you guys might have other motivations, but that's why we get up. So steps that seem simple that are difficult to implement, you want to avoid that hyperhydration. Don't increase your work hours because you've increased breaks. Don't let that happen in your supply chains, or if you're working with a producer. That's just replacing intensity with duration. And everything in epidemiology is about intensity, duration, and frequency. Those are your 3 watchwords, and if they're interchangeable. So if you cut down on intensity but increase duration, you're probably going to end up with a similar risk. And then natural shade is the best shade. And people want to be very rote about, like, oh, they have to go to the shade tent. But if you really want people to cool down, that mango tree or that roble in the field, that's where you want to hang out. Dennis has an excellent acclimatization program that he's developed on his own. He can send you the data on that. It's really important that your workers are acclimatized. We've talked about sanitation, but acclimatization is huge. The other one, if you're assessing a program, you have a program, you're Proforest, you're Solidaridad, you're Pantaleon, you're also working on a program, and it's an important program. You can't just do the cross-harvest measurements if you're doing them. You gotta follow your dropouts. And that means having a relationship with the communities and understanding who dropped out and why. Otherwise, you get what's called healthy worker effect, and you'll underestimate the kidney injury, which means you'll overestimate your impact. So this is year 1, right? So these are the people that completed the harvest, 21, 3, and 0. And you're thinking in seed cutter and irrigation field support, wow, we nailed it. But no, you go out to the community and you see that you really underestimated it. And so people that drop out are people that got sick generally. So you get the healthy workers or those who stayed. And this is a phenomenon in any epidemiological occupational study. It's not unique to this, but it's really important to this. What we do hope to get to is we feel like the implementation is almost there and our implementation assessment tool is almost there, as well as the design of the study, that most of you won't have to prick people's fingers or take their blood and figure this out. You'll just be able to assess adequate implementation and have a pretty good estimate on impact. And I would say we'd be done with that by this spring. That's pretty exciting. So return on investment, I don't like talking about this too much. If you want the data, we can send it, it's online. I don't like talking about it because I think there's something rather venal about calculating an ROI on people's lives. I know that sounds hardcore, but unpack it a bit. We have to really think about that. Why are we asking that question? Like, if it costed more money, would we not do it? So yeah, the good news is it's a positive ROI. You have less turnover, training, equipment, medical staff, everything we calculated led to a 22-cent on the dollar to a 30-cent on the dollar return on investment. So it's good news, but I hope this isn't the reason people are doing it. The other thing that we do now, and we really recommend from the front end, is an organizational assessment from the board down to the cutters. And this has been really helpful for Dennis and I to figure out like where the like links were that needed strengthening, where the education was needed. And we have a really great org psych team. And I can't recommend this enough. I think Dennis and I really wish we would have done this in year 1. We did it in year 3, and it was just super insightful, and it created change just by doing it and reporting the findings. And then when you target education from those findings, it's even more powerful. Another consideration we have to think through as an industry and rum and producers overall is people will work through illness. They'll override. Human beings have that frontal cortex. They'll be miserable. They'll be nauseous. They'll even be vomiting, and they'll push through because they need to provide. And that's a scary thing about us as a species. Like, we will push through misery and will cause ourselves harm. And when you look at the need for a living wage and like what people are average pay, and they're in the middle, despite what the supposed minimum wage may be, we've got a problem. And if we have the piece rate situation, that's going to drive people even more. Now, a lot of sugar mills hit the living wage, but not all. And this is monthly in US dollars for the Northern Triangle. So it's something we have to think about. I know it's a contentious issue right now, but let's make it a data-driven conversation, because think of all the time we could have saved if we just stuck to the data on CKD&T and heat stress. You know, we got there. It took us another 5 years than it needed to, in my opinion, though. And that's a lot of lives. So let's think about this next, and let's just be cool, calm, and collected and get the data and figure out how we can help folks live a healthier life. The other big one is mechanization. Meredith and I talk about this a lot. Meredith at UDNF Man. It's, you know, like in a cold calculus, this is probably your best intervention. This gets people out of the environment. But if it's done willy-nilly, if it's done without forethought, if it's done without consideration with development banks and development institutions, this is a disaster. And there have been semi-successful efforts in Brazil, but they weren't fully successful now that we've looked back. And I'm not sure it's possible to be fully successful, to have increased job training and new economies without a real concerted effort. So mechanization is happening. We're conducting a study to look at current trends and what will drive it, be it the perception of increased costs from OSH, occupational safety and health, or any actual increased costs. But this is something I think Bonsucro and a number of us, we really need to think through. The big idea here is that the lessons learned here will be used for other sectors and other regions. And we've had a lot of support to get that out there. It's been great. And World Vision's been a really great partner as well in Mexico and Fori. For those of you who have to tick these boxes, we believe they tick these. But thanks a lot. I really want to thank ISA, Ingenio San Antonio, Vinmonopolet, Bonsucro, our team, the workforce. You know, a lot of us lived in these communities for years. We know this issue really intimately. one of our researchers still lives in La Isla, where we take our name from, as a community leader and also an engineer. So we're really connected to the ground, and I just want to thank everybody who deals with this day to day. And then if anyone wants to contact LIN, by all means, contact Evan. He's our interface with, especially with corporate partners, and we'll get going. And I also want to thank Coca-Cola and Diageo, because we're looking at how to integrate our findings from the work into their supply sourcing, and that's huge. So thank you to Coca-Cola and Diageo. I mean, that is hats off. That's a big deal to take what we're learning here to help them better assess their supply chains, work with their suppliers. You know, we're going to do that together regardless, it looks like. But if we get this big DOL grant that's out, we're going to be able to really put it to work in the region in Mesoamerica and beyond. But I was really so pleased to see that level of support from them and in short order. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Jason, and also to everyone else that's attended. I see we have 6 more minutes. Rafa, you're also coming back online. I just wanted to remind everyone that there was a poll, and we really appreciate your candor in it. And we will also look into the possibilities for next year from Vinmonopolet side. We've applied for 100,000 NOK for implementation guidance, and we hope that the rum supply chain will be willing and want to work with us on rolling out more implementation with the help of Jason. Also, Rafa, you have some interesting developments going on with regards to the standard. You mentioned it a little bit before.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Sasha. So we are reviewing the production standard. We received a lot of comments. I think in the last public consultation, over 1,000 individual feedback. And yeah, the working group that is leading the review is now processing all that information. We released a summary of the key comments, and yeah, the working group will be developing the final draft. But yeah, I think it's very important that this learning from the Adelante initiative is being embedded, and I think it's a continuous process. We know there's no sustainability is never ends, right? So we're always learning more and adapting. And yeah, I think when we start expanding into new countries like Mexico now and gathering more data and learning more from the work that Isla is carrying out, I think we'll continue to improve that. And the aim is always to scale up through the standard as well to reach more producers and benefit more workforces. So yeah, just wanted to thank Jason for his presentation, and thank you all again for attending. Please do feel free. We know we're closing now, but we do have a couple of minutes. So if you have any questions, you can either write on the chat or we can unmute you. And as Sasha said, please respond to the poll. That would be very interesting. I'm not sure if we're sharing the results right now.